On the evening of the 1st of November 2003 in Blackpool, a seaside town in the northwest of England, 14-year-old Charlene Downes disappeared, literally without a trace. To this day, she's still not being found, failed by every institution that should have been there to protect her. However, nobody could predict that the disappearance of one girl would unearth one of the largest child sexual exploitation rings in England. This is the case of Charlene Downes. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me. If you are new to my channel, my name is Emma Kenny. I release my crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously. So crime and consistency is my catchphrase, and if you like routine, this is definitely the channel for you. Also, just gonna say before I start my video today that I do have a baby that I've just birthed in fact, down by my feet. She does at times make sounds like a small growling dinosaur. So if you hear odd mutterers and utterances whilst I'm doing this video, I'm not going to stop it. I never do stop my videos, but genuinely it's not because there are strange animals running around at my feet, just a very small 2-week-old baby. That said, today's video is one that I've been asked to cover by you so many times, and it's also one that's really close to my heart because I've worked in child sexual exploitation and trafficking, and it's something therefore that I have a really good knowledge of experientially, professionally, and also I have a real passion for surfacing the realities of these awful situations that have played out. I'm quite local to Blackpool. It's only about 40 minutes down the road. Used to go a hell of a lot when I was a kid, still go with my own children. At the end of the day, it's a place that is highly nostalgic for me. Love a bit of Blackpool rock, love going up the tower, used to go to the circus when I was a kid. All of those things, along with Blackpool Pleasure Beach, makes it a place that just reminds me of childhood. But often, in some of the most wonderful places that we remember from our childhood, there is a dark underbelly. And Blackpool is certainly a place where that dark underbelly exists. And today's case is certainly going to highlight that. So let's look at Charlene Downes, who she is, where she came from, family, etc. So she was born on the 25th of March 1989, and she actually moved with her family from the West Midlands in 1999 to Blackpool. So basically she moved there when she was 10 years of age. She lived on Buchanan Street in Blackpool with her parents Karen and Robert Downes. Robert Downes was a former soldier, as well as her brother and 2 sisters. Now, the area that their family live in, I would say, is economically quite challenged. It's known to be quite a poor, run-down area. There are very few amenities. Also, relatively high level of street crime, and it's an area, therefore, that we understand will have more social issues at times than areas that maybe have more economic security and privilege. Described by people around her as a really lovely, bubbly girl. She wasn't without her issues. Her mother described her as somebody who really likes a laugh. She was somebody who was really well and really happy before her disappearance, even though, like I said, life wasn't perfect. And she wasn't somebody who always towed the line when it came down to behaviour, but she was somebody who was enjoying life, and she was clearly loved. She looked very young for her age, I definitely noticed that. And when you look young for your age, but chronologically you're actually older, there can be a real problem there because you are developing on one level, but you also have a vulnerability about you because of the way that you look, because it can attract a certain type of individual. So on one side, you genuinely are growing into the young woman you're becoming. And on the other side, individuals who maybe don't have your best interests at heart might be attracted to you because of the fact that you do look younger than you actually are. She was somebody who was mischievous. That would be the word that I would apply to describe Charlene. So she was somebody who got herself into a bit of trouble, but as somebody who themselves got into trouble at school, as somebody who really didn't enjoy the school experience, I can relate to young people who are struggling to fit in. She'd recently been excluded from school for truancy, which is always ironic. Listen, you aren't coming to school, so what we're going to do is we're going to punish you by saying you don't need to come to school. Seems a little bit topsy-turvy. A little bit weird to do that. Surely it'd be more punishment to say you have to come to school and we're going to make you come to school. But again, a lot of young people, they don't enjoy fitting in the boxes that the academic system provides. And for Charlene, that would be the case. Just because she didn't enjoy going to school does not mean that she's a naughty child at all. It just means that it's a square peg trying to fit into a round hole. It's as simple as that. I would say that her family, from what I understand, is very loving. They are a close-knit family, or they were a close-knit family, but also they did have issues. But a lot of families have issues, particularly when you think about poorer socioeconomic standards, the issues that can arrive from living in an area that isn't necessarily conducive to safety all the time, and so on and so forth. So what social services said about Charlene's family is they were a chaotic one, and that maybe at times they did things that arguably from the outside looking in is very kind. So for example, at the time of Charlene's disappearance, there was a homeless man who one of the family members invited to stay was actually revealed as a sex offender against young children. But even though that shows a kindness of the family, it also shows that maybe they're not thinking genuinely ahead about the kind of individuals that they've got around their kids. But they wouldn't be inviting a sex offender knowingly to be in their home, and they wouldn't be knowingly putting their children at harm. So chaotic it might be, but that doesn't mean that Charlene wasn't loved or didn't feel loved, and it doesn't mean that the family wasn't a close-knit, loving family. They clearly were. And I would say that her mother has definitely been highly committed throughout this case, from its onset onwards, to finding out what happened to her daughter. And again, that's representative of somebody who doesn't give up because they love their children. So when you read reports that will cast certain aspersions on the family, I suppose, and say that they were imperfect, I always think you have to imagine why those kind of things are said. And often if there have been systemic failures, particularly by authority, it's very easy to pick out the problems in a situation, such as a family, and then amplify them, because it helps with the narrative that's being peddled that it wasn't necessarily the authorities' fault, maybe the blame lies with the family, etc. So I think we always have to be really careful to unpick why these kind of things are said and why we have that knowledge, such as, oh, they were a chaotic family. Because I've worked in safeguarding, and yes, you do get families who are really chaotic, and you do get families who you look at and you think to yourself, well, ideally they shouldn't do A, B and C. But when it comes down to a level of harm for the children, on the whole, chaotic doesn't mean harmful. It just means a little bit loud, disorganised, at times maybe not sticking to routines that we might think are best for children. And arguably, like I said, if that's going to be levied against the family because something awful happens to them, when really on a safeguarding level there wasn't anything too treacherous about the situation, albeit in this case, obviously, we were introducing the fact that a homeless man who had been a sex offender had been invited to stay with the family. That is a problem. But again, you have to remember that that's not why that individual ended up there. They ended up there because somebody was offering them a place to stay. And I just think it's important when there is those systemic failures that I'm going to look at today as to why these messages about the family are amplified, when maybe it's important to amplify the real failures that occurred and that had nothing necessarily to do with the family itself. So Charlene's mother, Charlene Downes, she actually said that her daughter basically around the age of 13 fell in with the wrong crowd. And a lot of people will acknowledge that their own children have done that. A lot of us will acknowledge that as 13-year-olds, you're dealing with relationship issues, you're dealing with peer friendship problems, you're dealing with academic concerns, you're dealing with your developing body, you're dealing with being on the cusp of being a teenager and young person versus a child, and everything can be overwhelming and confusing, and very often we don't really know who we are at that moment in time. When you meet a group of other people who want you as part of their group and might be into things that are a little bit negative for you, you don't consider that. What you consider is, I want to be around these people. They make me feel happy, they're a bit mischievous, a bit naughty, and often we find ourselves in hot water because we don't see the problems, we see the positives in those situations. And I imagine that Charlene was excited by a group of friends, even though they might not have been ideal for her. So she starts going off the rails, and Charlene Downes, her mother, said that she didn't know why. But I think what I've just highlighted is probably a good reason. And also I think that there was problematic behaviour unknown to the family that Charlene was involved in that I'll cover later on. Now, Charlene is last sighted on the 1st of November 2003. The week that she went missing, apparently everything seemed normal. Her mum actually said that it was only days after she went missing that she was due back at school to discuss going back. So it wasn't even as if she was excluded permanently from school. There was a potential for her to return. I'm sure they were thinking about a support package. There was nothing arguably that Charlene would be running from. And again, the fact that she was going back potentially to school indicates that there were positives going on in her life, and that she wasn't in a position where there was a level of hopelessness or helplessness to some degree in her home environment and in her education environment. So her going missing, it was quite a strange occurrence, although not completely out of her behaviour. There were issues prior to this that suggested that this was not uncommon for her to consider doing for a period of time. So we get to the afternoon of the 1st of November 2003. She spends time with her sister Rebecca. They'd actually been to Blackpool Promenade. They played on the fruit machines at Coral Island Amusement Arcade, somewhere I've been many times when I was growing up with my kids. And then they went to McDonald's. At 6:45 p.m, they walked up Church Street, where her mother was handing out leaflets for a local Indian restaurant. They went there just to say hi to their mum. And again, that kind of demonstrates a positive relationship between mum and Charlene, you know, the fact that they popped up there to go and say hello to their mum. And the three of them chatted, and then Rebecca decided that she was going to go home. Charlene wasn't finished, shall we say. She decided that she was going to ring some friends. She went to a nearby phone box to do that, and then she met up with them. Her mother says, you know, that memory of her saying goodbye was when she hugged and kissed her. That was the last time that Charlene Downes ever saw her daughter. And it's hard to imagine how that must be for any parent whose child just disappears. Whether that's a child that's killed in an accident, whether it's a child who's murdered, whether it's a child who just never comes home and no one knows where they are. They've just disappeared into the ether. So for Karen, that's the last memory she has. Just an ordinary day, an ordinary conversation with an extraordinary outcome. Around 9:30 p.m, Charlene and the group of friends that she'd met leave the group, and they head to the Carousel Bar on the North Pier. Apparently they didn't stay very long. Then they went back into the town centre. It's around 10 p.m. at this point. Get to 11 p.m. and she parts ways with a friend. This is near Talbot Road, Abingdon Street area, and that is noted as the last time she was physically ever seen by anyone. She was reportedly wearing a pair of black jeans with a gold eagle design on the front and a black jumper with a white diamond pattern. She also had black boots on. And the police say that she might also have at the time been wearing a white cardigan or top with a hood. So that's the last time that she's spotted and the description of what she looked like the day that she disappeared. We get to the 3rd of November 2003. At this point, Charlene is actually reported missing by her family. Now, the reason for that, some people will struggle with, because a lot of us will think, well, at 13 years of age, why would you not instantaneously report your child missing? And I have to say that as a parent, if my child didn't come home and I didn't know where they were, I would, without a shadow of a doubt, be on the phone to the police immediately, without question. But again, every family is different and every experience within a family is different. And for Charlene's family, it was not the first time that she'd gone missing. So her mother said when she was 12, she didn't come home for 4 days, and it turned out that she was staying with a friend and she just hadn't told her mum. So when Charlene didn't come home, her mum assumed that this had been something that she'd done again. That's why essentially she was not reported missing for 2 days. And I think that a lot of people will stand in judgment of that. And I think it's okay to stand in judgment of that. Everyone has their own belief systems about appropriate behaviour as a parent. I do think it was neglectful not to have actually reported Charlene going missing. I think that the first 24 hours after a child disappears is absolutely crucial if you want that child returned. And I think that it is neglectful to fail to do that. I also accept that everybody has their relationships in the family, and your connection with a child based on their behaviour in your home means that you will act according potentially to that relationship and your prior experience. In this case, the fact that Charlene had done it before was enough for her mother to not be that concerned about. But like I said, personally, it would terrify me if my child did not return home to me at the time they're meant to, let alone within 48 hours. So it's 2 days later before the police are aware of this, and this is at the point where their investigation begins. And throughout the investigation, there's over 3,000 people interviewed. So it's a big, old investigation where they're trying to look at different leads that could potentially bring Charlene home, or alternatively give some indication of what has happened to her. And the police, wow, they get a lot of sightings, a lot of potential sightings of Charlene. So someone said that they saw her sleeping rough on the streets. Someone said that they'd seen her getting on a train. Some person actually said that they'd seen her dead on the railway tracks. So understandably, the police have to look at all these statements. They have to go with every single lead that they hear about, but every single one of them turns up to be a dead end. And Charlene never returns home, and also her body's never found. And people stop noting that they've seen people who potentially are her or look like her. It's just as if the case goes cold. Now, what I would say about Karen and mother is that in spite of the fact that there might be some judgments against her regarding how she dealt with the initial situation, once she realises that Charlene really has disappeared, she acknowledges that there seems to be almost a radio silence about her daughter's disappearance. It's getting no national publicity, it's getting no TV coverage, there's no newspaper stories about her. And that feels like an abject failure, both societally and in the media. At the end of the day, this is a 13-year-old young girl. She looks even younger, and she's just disappeared without a trace. Why is the news not lighting up with this information? And Karen Downes is deeply concerned because she knows that the little information that's out there is likely not enough to turn up her daughter if she's run away, or if she's been abducted, or if her body's found somewhere, and so on and so forth. And that really deeply concerns her, and rightly so. So she ends up getting in touch with the local paper. It's called the Blackpool Gazette. And they, at this point, agree to run the story. Now, they told Karen Downes, as in the Gazette spoke to her about this, that they already knew about her daughter's disappearance. But the police had basically said to them, this is just a runaway case. Now, the police have not had that conversation with Charlene's family. So essentially, they're letting people know, oh, stand down, no panic. This child is a runaway by choice. Even though this child is a minor, is a very young kid, and yet they're not panicking about the logistics of getting this child home, even if she has run away, or considering the wider picture, which is, yes, Charlene has gone away for 4 days before and stayed with a friend, but that hasn't happened this time. This seems far more sinister and more deeply concerning because she isn't coming home. And if you think about the fact that the police were literally informing the papers to essentially not be concerned about her, imagine all of the potential witnesses that they lost. Imagine if they had gone ahead immediately when her mother had reported her missing and they had published that story immediately. Suddenly, you could have had a flurry of information. And the problem is, one of the things about Blackpool is a transience level. People come for a day. They come for a couple of days. They stay in a B&B. They go to Pleasure Beach. And this means that unless things are nationally publicised, those witnesses who saw her wouldn't even hear about the story and wouldn't relate to the fact that they had seen somebody who matches her description in that area, potentially with perpetrators that were with her. They wouldn't hear about it. And by the time it does get nationally published or on the news locally, that person is very unlikely to connect the time frame they were there with the disappearance of this girl. And unless that kind of trigger happens in your brain, often the pieces of the jigsaw get missed out because people don't come forward to the police at that point. So understandably, Karen Downes is still angry about the fact that her daughter's disappearance, and as far as we are concerned, death, has barely been even talked about outside of Blackpool at that point. And in fact, with respect, still the publicity that should have been afforded it has never really been afforded it. She said, I couldn't understand why the police did not put out information about Charlene on TV and why only the local paper was interested in her. In fact, she said, I often wonder if she'd been from a posh family and was having piano lessons, would they have tried harder to find her? And sadly, I would say the answer is yes, because they would have looked at a middle-class child from a family with privilege and imagined that that child would not have run away. Whereas with Karen Downes' family, they would have looked in and thought, oh, well, this is more the typology of a child who would leave a home by choice, even though there was really no weight towards why they would believe that. There was no reasoning, truthfully, that would mean that Charlene would not have come home. But like I said, bias does a lot to stereotype certain situations and people. And I think in this case that happened. Now, for Karen Downes, not knowing where Charlene is, she says is almost worse than knowing that she's dead, because it's not been confirmed that Charlene has actually been officially murdered. But clearly that's the belief. Equally, there's always that small window of hope and possibility that people can't help but covet. And it's the not knowing that destroys people. It's the not knowing that haunts people. It's the not fundamentally having the answers and closure so that we understand what our child went through, even in the most horrific of circumstances. The knowledge is not empowering, but it is something that can give us a sense of understanding and allows us to process what happened. Because part of coming to terms with loss is processing even the most traumatic loss in a way that we get used to having those conversations with ourselves about the reality of what played out. If you don't have those answers, there are a million possibilities that you play through your brain, none of which ever come to fruition, so that you can actually not make peace with it, because you can never make peace with your child being murdered, but you can at least process it to a point of understanding, as horrific as it is, it's something that at least is real and knowledge-based, as opposed to what you imagine in your worst nightmares based. Now, when the police actually do start looking for the potential outcomes of what's happened to Charlene, one of the things that they start to realise is there is that dark underbelly that I was talking about earlier on. So the police uncover what was, I would say, barely a hidden secret. You know, it's meant to be hidden, but I think there's some brazen behaviour in the local area, because genuinely, as far as I'm concerned, there was endemic child sexual abuse and prostitution that was just everywhere in Blackpool. It genuinely was. So they start speaking to potential witnesses. They start asking around about Charlene's behaviour, what she was doing at the time of her disappearance, what she was involved in, what was going on in her social life. And as police start to interview people, it becomes horrifyingly clear that Charlene, and actually a pile of other girls, had basically been swapping sex for food, cigarettes, alcohol. So basically we're talking about a form of child sexual exploitation. It's known as localised grooming. This is where essentially individuals will start to groom young girls with mobile phones, cigarettes, things that essentially they would like but can't afford. And gradually these individuals will give them these items, but then it becomes what you will have to do for this is A, B or C. And in this case, we're talking about sexual favours that can't be consensual because a child cannot consent, but these grown men demand it. And this is how we see girls falling in to this kind of sexualised behaviour and this groomed experience of being exploited. Now, there were 60 local girls targeted, and some of those kids were as young as 11. So when the police were doing these interviews, employees of 11 takeaway shops in Blackpool town centre have been grooming white girls, mostly aged between the ages of 13 and 15, which is absolutely horrifying. For those of you who've heard about the Rotherham sex exploitation or the Oldham sex exploitation, this again was something that demonstrated a complete lack of police engagement. No one wanted to challenge these particular male individuals because people thought it would be considered racist to do that, because it was mainly Pakistani males who were doing it, which is ludicrous. That's not racially profiling. It's got literally nothing to do with the major population of Pakistani males. It's to do with a small contingent of these individuals who have absolutely no respect for Western girls and believe that those individuals are lesser than other women, shall we say, from their own community, and can be used accordingly. It is a mindset of a small contingent of these individuals, but nonetheless, it is absolutely magnified in that particular population. And it's not racist to tell the truth. It's as simple as that. Much like we would say that the average pedophile in the UK is white, because that's true. It's not racist, it's just statistically appropriate. But basically, during this absolute massive exposure of the reality of what's been going on behind closed doors, although, like I said, a lot of people knew about it, is that Charlene herself had been groomed and exploited for at least 1 year prior to her disappearance. And you have to remember that a lot of the time these girls weren't even aware that they'd been groomed, weren't even aware that they were being sexually exploited, because essentially they felt that they were complicit in the abuse. And this is what is problematic for these kids. They genuinely think because they accepted mobile phones, or they accepted food, or they accepted alcohol, or they had a good time at times with these perpetrators, that somehow they're complicit in their own abuse, and therefore they don't have a right to be protected. So it's a really complex thing to navigate when you're a victim. Now, before Charlene's disappearance, the child abuse epidemic in Blackpool had basically been hidden, or it had been disguised, because there's a real party atmosphere. There's loads of happy looking kids with buckets and spades on the beach. So it's kind of a juxtaposition to, like I said, that dark underbelly of what really is going on. Now, there's a woman called Sue McGurty. She's the coordinator of mothers of sexually abused children. And she says there have always been levels that are shocking where sexual abuse of children in this town are concerned. But before Charlene Downes went missing, it was literally swept under the carpet. And that demonstrates just such a lack of care and consideration for the most vulnerable kids. Because even though middle-class kids do get sexually exploited, I'm telling you now, the mass amounts of young people who get sexually exploited tend to come from working class environments and backgrounds. Usually these perpetrators like to go for kids who've got a level of dysfunction in their family, or a poverty within their experience. That means that they're going to be a lot more vulnerable because they're offered food, cigarettes, alcohol, and that's going to be very alluring when you can't afford it, and so on and so forth. So these perpetrators know exactly what they are looking for. And the fact that the authorities were complicit in ignoring this abuse is horrifying. Now, as I've said, poverty levels in Blackpool are really high, rated 12th poorest area in the country. It remains in a similar position even today. Now, the figure of children who are on Blackpool's Child Protection Register who are either vulnerable to or actually experiencing sexual abuse is 16%. You heard that correctly, 16%. That's almost twice the national average. I mean, don't get me wrong. The idea that the national average is 8% is absolutely horrifying. Let that sink in. Just let that sink in. The level of child sexual abuse in the UK, and it's the same all over the world, higher in other places, is absolutely catastrophically terrible. But 16% of children in Blackpool who are on the Child Protection Register are literally noted to be vulnerable to or experiencing sexual abuse, which is absolutely horrifying. And also, the same goes when it comes down to children living in care. So that's twice the national average as well. And realistically, you just have to put yourself in a position where you think about vulnerability. There are no children more vulnerable than those living in care homes, because they haven't got the parental guidance available to them. People aren't necessarily watching them as acutely as they would in their own homes. And certainly the vulnerability psychologically for those kids is huge compared to children who are brought up by parents who are caring and loving. And at the time of Charlene's actual disappearance, A statistic that again is pretty scary is that underage unprotected sex is very common for kids in Blackpool, with 1 in 12 girls pregnant before the age of 16. Now, when they looked at Charlene's disappearance and mirrored it with those stats, they put that down to the resort's, as they called it, carnivalistic and hedonistic atmosphere. But that makes no sense whatsoever. You know, there are lots of places in the UK where there's a carnival going on all the time because, you know, it's got a fun fair, it's got arcades, it's very much a tourist boom industry in the summer, but they're not getting pregnant 1 in 12 girls under the age of 16. It's more than that. It's a sense sometimes of dealing with a level of dysfunction that makes you feel unloved. So you're looking for love and validation, which is why you end up having underage sex, and you keep your baby a lot of the time because you feel that you're going to have somebody that loves you. So it's bigger than just saying, oh, it's because people are having a really good time. It's a big party town. No, personally, I believe it's more to do with economic deprivation, and on top of that, dysfunction, and children who are trying to grow up too fast, desperately looking for some kind of validation. And sex, unfortunately, meets that need for a very temporary amount of time. But again, if there's lots of young people having sex, then that is going to mean that if you find yourself in a situation where you're being groomed by one of these exploitation gangs, you're not necessarily seeing the issue of your age as a problem it is, because others around you seem to be acting this way similarly. And the problem with that is it creates this almost permission base to do things that are terrible for you and that make you feel that once you don't enjoy doing that, but you've done it, that somehow you are responsible for what's happened, which you are not because you're a child. So that idea that this is just to do with the area makes absolutely no sense when it comes down to the hedonistic side. It makes sense when it comes down to the dysfunction and poverty side. Now, there are also in Blackpool, a statistic which is terrifying, 800 convicted high-risk sex offenders living there. That's right. Not exactly what you want to get when you go to the pleasure beach for a fairground ride, is it? 800 convicted high-risk sex offenders. I have to say, I found that statistic terrifying because I used to happily take my children to Blackpool. Now it makes me rethink and reconsider. Not because I don't think the area is incredible. I don't think that the people are lovely. I do. They are really lovely people in Blackpool. But I don't want that number of sex offenders in an area that I send my kids. It's horrifying. Now, the Coalition for the Removal of Pimping, which is called CROP, which is a child protection charity which is based in West Yorkshire, they actually warned that Blackpool is literally becoming one of the hot spots where children and young people are sold for sex to older men. It's grotesque. And yet, this is what Charlene's disappearance unearthed. It's very hard to find any type of silver lining in any situation involving the disappearance of a child. But what Charlene's legacy has done, it's uncovered this absolute gross dysfunction in the area. It's highlighted the inappropriately high levels of sexual interest in children. Now, of course, initially, the police, it seems, treated Charlene's disappearance as a runaway. We know that because of what her mum found out with the local paper. We know that because there wasn't this massive press and media interest in her disappearing and not coming home. So it wasn't actually treated as a murder inquiry until 2006. Now, at this point, 2 men did get arrested on suspicion of a murder. That was Ayad Albatiki, originally from Jordan, and he was the owner of the local Funny Boys takeaway. He was essentially accused of murdering and abusing Charlene. And Mohammed Ravishi, he was 50, he was a former Iranian army sergeant, landlord of 42 properties, so relatively successful, and also Albatiki's business partner. Both of those end up getting accused of disposing of Charlene's body. Now, I have to say, both of these individuals insisted that they've literally never ever met Charlene, but at the time, the evidence appeared, shall we say, somewhat damning. So police obviously had these guys on their radar, and they'd actually bugged both suspects' houses, cars and workplace. Very intrusive, but nonetheless, covert operations require that, particularly if they believe that there are child killers at large, because they can strike again. Now, on the tapes, Al-Batiki was actually heard casually joking about having sex with Downes, even going on to explain that he'd killed her, then taken a body, chopped it up, put it through a meat grinder, it's takeaway, and then had sold that meat that would have been Charlene as kebab meat. He also apparently said that he'd taken her bones and ground them into tile grout. Then on another recording, Alberticki was actually heard asking about how long fingerprints last, to which Raveshi actually responded reassuringly saying, there is nothing left of her. She was here. She died. There really is nothing. So if you heard that with your intel, that is going to make you prick your ears up and think, my God, we've got these child killers on the loose. We need to immediately arrest them and bring them to justice. Because if you have two guys basically bragging about taking this girl, murdering her, then grinding her bones up for tile grout, and also feeding her body to unsuspecting customers in a kebab shop, it couldn't be more horrifying and it couldn't be more guilt-laden. And essentially, if you've got that information and intel, you're going to do everything in your power to make sure that those individuals never walk the streets again. So these individuals are arrested, they're charged, and it goes to court. And these recordings were actually played to the jury in May 2017, where both of the suspects were standing trial. Both of the suspects said from the get-go they were not guilty. And when they play the tapes to the jury, what's noted is that Charlene's name's never actually said in the tapes. It's only implied. So even though there is this incriminating information, so to speak, they never actually utter her name. And that's a problem for a jury, because remember, what do you have as a jury to make a decision based on? You have to decide if there is reasonable doubt, you acquit them, you don't find them guilty. And if they haven't identified that this is specifically who they're relating it to, well, arguably, you could be talking about anybody, or you could just be having a bit of a laugh with a friend and saying things that are highly inappropriate, but it doesn't necessarily link you to what we're talking about today, which is the disappearance of Charlene. And bear in mind, what makes it even more difficult is there is no body that's been found. So they're actually trying people on suspicion of murder without really knowing that she had indeed been murdered. But one thing that the prosecution did manage to do, so the prosecutor is called Mr. Hollywood, they found a witness who could testify that they'd heard Alberticki and others actually talking about Charlene. They said these people were talking about sex with white girls and there was mention of having sex with Charlene. Now, Alberticki laughed and basically at the time said that she was very small, indicating obviously the experience that he'd had with her sexually. But one could say, well, that surely is a clear indicator that he knew her, because she was very small and he hadn't indicated that he knew Charlene at all. So on two levels, he knew what she was like size-wise, and on another level, he'd actually mentioned her name in front of this witness. The witness also stated that she was one of a number of adolescent white girls who sometimes went to an alley at night, which was behind the restaurants, and that was where she and others went to meet much older men from the restaurants. And it seemed perfectly clear that what was being implied was there was some sexual activity there. Now, at the same time that this was happening, Alberticki was actually facing a rape trial as well. Now, subsequently that trial was dropped, but one could say, wow, there seems to be quite a lot of suggestions of negative behaviour towards this individual, because most of us don't get accused of rape and certainly don't get accused of murder in our lives. But like I said, that got dropped, so he wasn't actually facing any kind of charges in the long term for that rape. Now, the jury, they were also told of 10 separate incidents involving Alberticki and Raveshi, where girls between the ages of 13 and 15 were concerned. So even if they are not necessarily being seen as murderers, they're certainly not being seen in a very good light regarding their sexual conduct around young people and children who cannot consent to sex. However, when it came to making a decision over whether these men were guilty or innocent, they couldn't reach a verdict. So half felt that the evidence they heard was enough to put the men in jail for a very long time, shall we say, and the other half felt that there was reasonable doubt. For example, police hadn't found a body. So that in itself was going to be a big problem. And that meant that essentially the jury was hung and they didn't actually come to a situation where they would be able to say whether they were guilty or innocent, which is really problematic. It's very expensive, it's extremely frustrating, and of course it brings no closure to anybody whatsoever. It's also pretty horrific if you are somebody who's standing trial for something you didn't do and you get to a point where you think, maybe I'm going to get reprieved of this and I won't have to think about it again, and actually you find out, well, it could be that there's a whole retrial that's going to happen and you're back at square one. Now, after the trial was over, one of the things that did get discovered was that a member of the jury actually knew one of the defendants, which is a big issue. You have to disclose that. If you do not disclose it, it can completely compromise the legalities, and it can mean that even if a case had been found guilty or innocent, you might have to retry it anyway because somebody had lied on the jury. Also, it's reported that one of the defendant's brothers actually followed some of the members of the jury and attempted to intimidate them, which is horrifying. That's one of the things that I think speaks to a sense of guilt, because at the end of the day, why would you need to intimidate anybody if the evidence speaks for itself? Arguably, some people would say, well, maybe the reason that he wanted to intimidate the jury was because he totally trusted that his brother was innocent and he wanted to help with that result. But that is absolutely terrifying, that the brother was so arrogant, so superior, and so refusing to accept the legalities that we go through in these scenarios to ensure that a fair trial occurs, and instead intimidated witnesses to try to get them to be on side with his particular perspective. Now, obviously, at this point, it's looking towards a retrial, but there are problems. So there are problems because there's concerns about witnesses. Also, some people believe there's a lack of evidence regarding the retrial. So it's scheduled for April 2008. Before April actually comes around, senior police officers actually raised objections to the surveillance evidence. So their evidence that they'd collected, they decided needed to be objected to. So at this point, the CPS are informed. Now in the UK, the Crown Prosecution Service decides whether a case is going to be tried in court or thrown out. Now that does not mean that the CPS do not believe there is a potential guilt. It means they feel that there is enough within the public interest for a case to be tried at court and the decision is made there. So, like I said, there are a lot of cases that get to the CPS that are thrown out that should not get thrown out, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, it's how it works. So when the CPS get wind of the fact that the police officers have raised these objections, they basically find no evidence against the two men. And that means that both of the men at this point are released. So the trial's called off. Also, bear in mind, these individuals are innocent. They have been dragged through the courts. They have been dragged through the court of public opinion as well. They've had their businesses and families impacted on, and they have been tarred with a brush that says you are a child molester. They are big reputational issues, and understandably, people want those addressed. So both of them were actually paid £250,000 in compensation, which means that if they were guilty, now not only have they walked away scot-free, but they've been very well paid for doing so. Of course, £250,000, if you're innocent, is nothing. Because like I said, your reputation is literally in tatters, and people always believe there is no smoke without fire. It's as simple as that. Now in April 2008, so that's 1 week after the failure of the retrial, one of the things that occurs that is really challenging for the Downes family is that Karen Downes actually stabs her husband during an argument. Now the wounds were minor and he didn't actually press charges against Karen Downes, but he said that basically he felt that all of the frustration that she had just built up. She was devastated by the fact the retrial hadn't happened. She hadn't managed to bring to justice who she might have believed were her child's killers, and this might have been another false start that she couldn't genuinely bear, and that had got to a point where she just lost it and essentially stabbed her partner. Understandably, That doesn't look good for Karen Downes, but again, none of us are in a position on the whole where we have to think about the loss of our child in the way that she did. So understandably, that venting, that frustration, that anger, that rage that she felt, it has to go somewhere. And unfortunately, it was projected in a direction where she didn't injure her partner badly, but nonetheless, it must have been incredibly traumatic for him. And it kind of gets worse for the Downes family with respect, which is awful because you think about how this kind of loss can impact on your family, the trauma, how that plays out, how that changes the direction of your life, how it haunts every single moment. So in March 2009, Charlene's sister Emma actually ended up pleading not guilty to racially aggravated assault against the brother of the man charged with murdering Charlene. Now, she maintains that there was nothing racially motivated at all about the assault. And actually, on the first day of her trial, the prosecution did accept her plea to common assault, and she was instead sentenced to community service. And that makes perfect sense. The idea that it's racially motivated because you attack somebody that you think might have been responsible for potentially perverting the course of justice in a trial against your sister's potential killer, or an individual who's related to somebody that you believe was your sister's killer, that isn't racially motivated. That's familially motivated. That's about you feeling an absolute sense of rage towards somebody that you blame for the disappearance and death of your sister. Even if she's wrong, to say that it was racially motivated is unfair. If you think somebody has killed your sister or been involved in helping protect somebody who's killed your sister, you're going to act in a way that is not in accordance with your normal morals and values on a day-to-day basis. You're going to act because you feel compelled to do so, because you can't protect your sister anymore, so you're going to protect the memory of her to some degree. Now, of course, because the court case was totally screwed up, there was this investigation into police handling. So the Independent Police Complaints Commission, the IPCC, they spent the next 18 months investigating, and wow, it did not look good for the police when the evidence came in. So they were able to reveal that there were so many severe flaws in the evidence. First of all, much of the recorded tape and video evidence, it just wasn't properly transcribed. Also, the officers who were actually working on the investigation were seen to be inexperienced and untrained, which, I don't know, should never be put in a sentence with the police. Inexperienced and untrained. It sounds, I don't know, deeply concerning. Surely it would be very experienced and incredibly well trained because, firstly, people's freedom is on the line. Secondly, a child's gone missing and potentially has been murdered. You want to find who's guilty of that. And most importantly, when evidence gets into court, if you can literally deconstruct it and you can criticise it, it's not going to go well. And that is deeply problematic when we think about what we're talking about in this case. So they found strategic and tactical failure in the management of evidence. Also, a police informant, David Cassidy, they provided most of the surveillance evidence and they were wearing this wiretap device. Now, bear in mind, if you have a police informant, there are going to be some things that you need to inform them of. And one of the most important things is you can't lead people to answer questions. You can't do that. You can't go with leading questions that can incriminate people because then it's seen as coercion. It's basically a form, I suppose, of entrapment. So it's not going to be admissible in court, which will mean that defence will have a field day with it. So they don't properly brief him. He's asking all these leading questions. That's not his fault. He was there to help and to do a job. But the consequence is that that caused major problems and flaws with the evidence per se. And then we have a problem with Detective Sergeant Jan Besant. They had the job of transcribing that secretly recorded conversations between Mr. Albertacchi and another man. So they spent 2,500 hours over 2 years listening to 52 audio tapes, but the quality of the covert recordings were actually criticised as poor, and also, unfortunately, the transcriptions were considered inaccurate. So all that stuff about hearing about Charlene being murdered in the way that she'd been murdered, etc., they're saying that when they actually looked at those transcribed narratives, they weren't actually accurate whatsoever. And again, the defence is going to rip that apart at a retrial, etc. So Besant was actually forced to resign in 2011. In fact, altogether, there were 10 officers disciplined to varying degrees, which is ridiculous. And the cost of this is enormous. And That demands the question, doesn't it? It begs the question, how incompetent was the investigation? Because if Charlene's disappearance had properly been investigated, would the killers have actually been found? And would the killers have faced justice? That's got to be the question that Charlene's family asks. There's also another real tragedy for this family, because in 2012, Charlene's younger brother admitted in court to punching Mohammed Revashi. Now, he was given a fine and he was also given a suspended sentence. But years later, he actually ended up taking his own life. And according to the family, the reason that he took his own life was because he could just never get over what happened to his younger sister. And again, that represents, I think, some suspicion still that the family had directed to the two individuals who ended up in court that didn't get a retrial. Again, it's not for me to say whether that's an entitled perspective or whether that's an incorrect perspective. The point is, you can imagine Charlene's family has these feelings and may believe that people got away with her murder, and that is down to the monumental failures and the systemic realities of those failures within the police. So you can just put yourself in the position of a family member who thinks, oh my God, people literally got away with murder where my sister is concerned, and wanting to retaliate and to project the anger that they felt onto anybody that they could that was related to that situation or potentially could have been involved in the disappearance of their sister or daughter, etc. So it must be a really challenging time emotionally for the family then and now. And the fact that he takes his life, for Charlene's mother and father, it's just incomprehensible to imagine how much loss and trauma they've endured. Now, the trial obviously eventually brought public attention to the extent of child sexual abuse in Blackpool. And the Awaken project, that was actually set up 1 year after Charlene disappeared, and it was as a direct response to the case. Now, the Awaken project is a positive project. So it brings together professionals from licensing, social services, education, and the police. And the whole aim of this is to root out and arrest child abusers before they do serious harm. So the premise is to protect children against sexual exploiters. The Awaken project itself has identified and protected hundreds of young people. Also, it's been responsible for bringing a number of offenders to justice since its establishment. And there are calls for that project to be extended to cover the whole of the UK. But so far, the government, unsurprisingly, because it's the government, has actually been really slow to respond, despite how successful that particular project has been in Blackpool. Doesn't surprise me at all that the government hasn't seen a project that's actually being effective and thought, oh, maybe we should, use it in all the other areas, because the statistics on child sexual exploitation and abuse is grotesque and ridiculous in the UK and needs to be combated. But why should we do that by actually using a prototype of effectiveness and transplanting that elsewhere to protect kids, when instead we can do nothing? Welcome to the UK and the government in the UK. Now, 13 years after Charlene disappeared, new footage surfaced. And again, this is blindsiding for the family. So in late 2016, detectives released previously unseen footage of Charlene. This was discovered apparently hidden in their own archives. After all this time, they had it. They had this footage from day one. It's unbelievable that this footage was only found after a new team of detectives were actually brought in to carry out a case review. Now, some people could say that would be quite a suspicious reality, wouldn't it? That it had always been there, this information, this footage that demonstrated what Charlene potentially was doing, where she was going, and yet was never put out. Now, Charlene Downes actually went ahead and pursued legal action. She said it was the final straw. There have been so many failings and they didn't actually take it seriously enough at the beginning. As we've noted, just what I've said, even really important material was held back or was missed. Either way, it's as bad. And she said, this isn't about the money. It's about principle. It's an absolute disgrace and an insult to the memory of my dead daughter. Maybe if the CCTV footage had been shown at the time, I could have got justice years ago and put Charlene to rest. But now my pain continues. And that footage, just so you know, that was the only confirmed CCTV footage of her on the day that she went missing. And that is so many years later. And that is a case of too little, too late. Now, on the 1st of August 2017, a 51-year-old man was actually arrested on suspicion of murdering Downes, but he ended up getting released just 2 days later. He's been the only other suspect since 2008, which is devastating because with every arrest, there is a possibility of hope for the family of bringing the individual or individuals who stole Charlene's life to justice. There is a potential of bringing whatever remains of her body home, shall we say. And every time that flicker of hope occurs, it's just extinguished. And it must be a daily consistent battle to know that someone is out there who knows exactly what happened to Charlene. As I said, the family aren't just dealing with this consistent reminder that Charlene's killers are out there. It's the fact that they've gone through the trauma of losing a son because of it as well. So it's multifaceted, their grief, and it's consistent and compounded by all of these things that fail to ever eventuate in the conviction of an individual or individuals who are guilty of taking their child away. Now, interestingly, her case was reopened this year, so that's ahead of the 20th anniversary of her disappearance. It's unbelievable, isn't it? 20 years have passed and still no one knows what became of her. So the cold case unit from Leeds Trinity University, they say they're examining the evidence and they're looking through all of that evidence again. They're on the hunt for fresh leads. Dr. Kirsty Bennett, a lecturer at the university specialising in cold cases, is working with Roni Crompton from the Justice for Charlene Downes campaign. As they rightly note, the team was let down by a system that was meant to be designed to protect her. Blackburn University are also undertaking a large child sexual exploitation project for the whole of Lancashire to find out what the scale of the problem is and also where children are being failed. And that's so key because at the end of the day, we don't want to see repeats of these failures. We don't want to see children disappearing, never coming home, and families being left in purgatory as they search constantly for answers. Charlene was failed literally by everyone that should have kept her safe. The police, social services, every single department let her down. Now, as this is still an ongoing case, that means that they are still asking for information. And even though the belief is that Charlene Downes is dead, any piece of the jigsaw can bring to light the answers that are so imperative and important for her family. So I am going to include in the description below that if anyone has any information, they can contact the incident room. The telephone number is there, also Crimestoppers, or you can actually email as well. And all of that is in the description below. The Charlene Downes case is one of the most frustrating to tell you because I can't give you any closure. I can't give you a sense of justice. I don't know who's guilty or responsible for her murder and disappearance. All I know is that massive mistakes were made, and the consequences of those mistakes might mean that the right people never actually have to face the justice that they so deserve. But there again, I'm a big believer in what goes around comes around, and I think that karma is a bitch. And at the end of the day, if the people who did harm her are out there, then I hope in the end they meet their maker and they realise that the things that they've done in this lifetime ended up having a major cost to the next one. I genuinely believe that evil people have evil outcomes in the end. And that's the only way that I make it through these kind of situations. Like I said, it's one of those scenarios that we would all like to have an answer about, but we can't. What we do know is that Charlene Downes might have lived an imperfect life. She might have had a chaotic family. She might have had certain problems, but she was loved. She was cared for. She was somebody that still has massive meaning to her family. And we should never, ever forget that someone out there has the answers. Someone out there has the information. And if you are somebody who knows an individual who's talked about Charlene Downes years later, you should pick up that phone and you should call the police and have that conversation because her family deserved to bring her home, whether that's just in the knowledge of what happened or whether that is indeed physically. If you know anything, please go on the description below, make a call and do the right thing. Take care, guys. Remember, be safe.